And welcome to the Twisted Sisters Mystery Podcast. My name is Michaela, and I'm one of the hosts. I'm typically joined by my sister Caitlin, but unfortunately she's feeling unwell and won't be able to make it for the recording today. My sister and I share a fascination and a passion for learning about true crime, cults, conspiracies, and all the other weird, strange, mysterious phenomenon that piques our curiosity. So if those sound like topics that you're interested in as well, please consider subscribing. And if not, and you're just here with us for today's video, then that's okay too. Thank you so much for joining us. If you enjoy the video, please consider liking or commenting on the video. Every single interaction with the video enhances my chances of somebody else finding this video, and that would just be so great for me, because then we could have a little community and we could all talk about these cases, and I would just love it so much, and I could continue creating more content like you're about to see. I'd also like to state that this video contains mature subject matter and viewer discretion is strongly advised. So today's case is a wild one. It genuinely sounds like something out of a sci-fi or a horror movie. I've always found this case particularly interesting, probably because it's so heavily referenced in popular culture. It was in X-Files. Stranger Things is loosely based off of this case, and tons of movies and tons of other TV shows and novels. It involves the CIA. Yes, that's the Central Intelligence Agency in the United States. It also involves the Canadian government, and the acts that were committed during this case were completely immoral, dehumanizing, and inhumane. Despite having happened over 50 years ago and being very well documented, we will never really know the full extent of the atrocities committed, because a lot of the documentation was lost and destroyed, unfortunately, by those in charge. If you haven't guessed today's topic already, I'm talking about one of the biggest conspiracies known to have been committed by the US government, the mind control experiments, MK Ultra. MK Ultra took place between 1953 and 1973. It was in response to things that were happening during the Cold War. There were several American and Canadian soldiers who came back after being in China and were expressing sympathies for the Chinese government, and also said that they were involved in germ warfare, which there was never any evidence of. After meeting with these soldiers, the US government assumed that the Chinese and the other members of the Soviet Union had found a way to control the minds of these soldiers, and they felt compelled to find a way to protect their own country and their own national security. And so the MK Ultra experiments began. Some of the largest and most well-known experiments to take place during MK Ultra were those that used the drug LSD. LSD was actually created accidentally in Swiss labs when a doctor was trying to find a cure for migraines. And of course, as soon as the US government heard about its mind-altering properties, it had to get its hands on some. A lot of the experimentation done using the drug LSD was done on unwitting suspects who had no idea that they were going to be consuming any drugs. The CIA often targeted expendable subjects who were people that society most likely wouldn't notice acting differently than they had before, or even if they had gone missing. These were people such as psychiatric patients and prisoners, but the CIA also experimented on regular citizens, soldiers, and even their own employees. Although the overarching name for the experiments were MK Ultra, there were several subcategories or sub-names for each experiment. One of the strangest experiments was called Midnight Climax, and the purpose of the experiment was to examine the effects of LSD in a sexual setting. So actresses were hired to perform as sex workers. They would go down to bars and lure men back to what they thought were brothels. Meanwhile, there were several men on the other side of a two-way mirror watching and observing the men while they were dosed with LSD and tripped and had hallucinations. I think the strangest part about this whole experiment was that the actresses were shown how to dose the men with LSD by a magician. They brought in a sleight of hand magician to teach the actresses how to pour the drugs into the men's drinks without being caught. I know there wasn't email back then, but can you just imagine getting that email as a magician? Like, hi, can you please come and teach these women how to slip drugs to men, pretty much. One of the most well-known cases of LSD dosing was that of Frank Olson in 1953 when MK Ultra had first begun. Frank Olson was a scientist in the CIA. He was employed by a man named Sidney Gottlieb, who was one of the main scientists who were orchestrating the LSD experiments. He tested on humans and animals. Employees would often come in to work for the morning and find piles of dead animal carcasses from his experiments. It was really traumatic for a lot of them, but not as traumatic as what is going to happen to Frank. So Frank and several of his co-workers were invited over for a dinner at Sidney's house, where they were unsuspectingly all drugged. They should have been expecting it, realistically, come on now. But anyways, they were all drugged, unsuspectingly, like I said, and they all just tripped at this dinner party, and after they were done, I guess they just all went on their merry way, and thanks for coming, thanks for stopping in for dinner and a little bit of drugging. I don't know, man. It's crazy that people didn't think these things would happen. But so Frank, after leaving the dinner, he had experienced long-lasting side effects from the drugs over the next several weeks. He was depressed, he was experiencing memory loss and irritability, and he was unable to perform common everyday tasks as he would have before the drugging. And for some reason, Frank decides it's a good idea to go back to his boss for advice. I guess he would be the best expert that Frank would consider, because it's a brand new drug and not many people know anything about it. So Frank returns to Sidney weeks after being dosed with LSD and expressed to him that he was experiencing long-lasting side effects, and he also expressed the fact that he feels that he may need to quit his job because of the effects that he was having with the LSD, and also probably because his boss had drugged him. Come on, let's be realistic here. I would quit. I hope you would too. It's pretty toxic. That's a toxic work environment right there. Anyways, so he tells Sidney that he might quit, and Sidney insisted that Frank sees this doctor friend of his in New York, and that he would be able to cure any of the illnesses or any of the ailments that Frank had been experiencing. So Frank goes to New York, visits with this doctor, and returns to his hotel room that night. Unfortunately, Frank would not wake up the next morning. It seems that Frank had fallen from the 10th story window of his New York hotel room and plummeted to his death. The death was ruled a suicide, but a lot of people question whether this was the actual cause of Frank's death or whether he had actually been pushed out of his window from CIA operatives. The theory goes that Sidney suspected Frank of being a whistleblower and did not trust that Frank would keep his secrets to himself, and so he sent people to New York to Frank's hotel room to eliminate the issue. Another set of experiments that we know took place during MKUltra involved hypnosis. Many psychological experiments were done at universities in Canada. Hypnosis was used to induce a state of heightened suggestibility and make subjects more susceptible to post-hypnotic commands. Scientists hope to increase receptivity to influence, to use hypnosis to elicit information from subjects, and also to influence subjects' behavior. One of the most well-known psychiatrists to take part in these experiments is named Donald Cameron. He did use LSD, but he also experimented mostly with other methods, mainly with different versions of hypnosis. So some of the methods that Cameron experimented with were hypnosis, which was induced by auditory or visual stimuli, and also through relaxation exercises. He also used medically induced comas, electromagnetic shock therapy, drug-induced paralyzation, and created a technique called psychic driving. The goal of psychic driving was to wipe the mind of the subject completely blank and to allow scientists to imprint new memories and identities in the subject. So basically, it was complete brainwashing. They could wipe anything that they wanted from the subject's memory, and they could imprint anything that they wanted directly into the mind. The process in which psychic driving was done was subjects would be put into medically induced comas or were given drugs to paralyze them completely so that they couldn't move. Cameron would then play continuous audio recordings on a loop, sometimes hundreds of thousands of times in a row. It's kind of like you'd see on a TV show or a movie where somebody would be trying to quit smoking and they would put on a tape and it would say, "You don't want to smoke, you hate the taste of cigarettes, blah, blah, blah." And it would repeat the phrases over and over again until the person miraculously didn't want to smoke anymore. It was kind of the same idea as that. Cameron actually documented several successful cases of wiping his subject's mind and imprinting new identities by using a combination of these methods. One of Cameron's most notable cases is that of Esther Schreier. She sought treatment from Cameron for feelings of depression. He prescribed her 30 days of medically induced coma. She endured 29 electroshock treatments, and she lost a significant amount of weight, despite being pregnant. That's right, she was getting electric shock treatment while pregnant. So Cameron eventually stopped the treatment because she was, quote, now in her 8th month of pregnancy. 8 months. She was almost full term, and she was getting electric shock treatment and being put into a medically induced coma. Who knows what those drugs could do to an unborn child? This is why history is so interesting and so riveting, because I can't believe the things that people didn't think through back. This wasn't even that long ago. This was like 60, 70 years ago now, but still not that long ago. It doesn't seem like that long ago, at least. The 1950s. So, like I said, Esther was pregnant, 8 months pregnant now, and she had stopped her treatment. Thankfully, the baby was born healthy, but Esther was completely a different person. She actually reverted somewhat back to childhood herself. She was unable to perform regular basic human functions and everyday tasks that she had been performing for years. She needed somebody to care for her now, and she was unfortunately unable to care for her own child. Thankfully, Esther was able to maintain a close relationship with her son despite not being able to care for him, and Esther lived a long life and passed away at the age of 84. There were also several other forms of psychological torture that were performed during MK Ultra. One of them was sleep deprivation. Subjects would be deprived of sleep for days, sometimes even weeks. The goal of this was sleep deprivation induced cognitive impairment, hallucinations, and extreme fatigue. Sleep deprivation really restricted the ability for the subjects to resist suggestion and maintain a full sense of reality. Another form of psychological torture that was performed on the subjects was sensory overload. So subjects would be put into a room and there'd be intense and continuous stimulation of one or more of their senses. So several noises going on at the same time, flashing lights, flashing pictures. I can only imagine that would just be so overwhelming. I get easily overwhelmed and overstimulated just having too many people around me in one room. I can't even imagine being subject to just noise, so many noises and just so much stimuli that it's just suffocating to you. The goal of this was to overwhelm the brain's ability to process information and put the subjects into a state of cognitive overload, which would open them up and make them more susceptible to influence and suggestibility again. Additional side effects of the sensory overload was anxiety, confusion, and severe disorientation. Additional side effects of the sensory overload were anxiety, confusion, and severe disorientation, which put them in a more vulnerable position where they were more easily manipulated by the experimenters. In addition to sensory overload, they also used sensory deprivation as a tactic. People would be isolated for very long periods of time, weeks, sometimes with no human interaction, no light, no sound, just complete darkness and nothing else. That's it. Just nothing. Completely deprived of any sensation or any stimuli. The side effects of the sensory deprivation were also pretty severe. Again, there were hallucinations, there was disorientations of time and space, and intense emotional states. MK Ultra ended in 1973 in the midst of Watergate. CIA Director Richard Helms was at risk of losing his job and was worried that the MK Ultra documents would be discovered, and so he ordered the immediate destruction of many of the documents. And this is why we will never really know the full extent of what took place during MK Ultra and during all of these experiments. We really only know this, we've only barely scratched the surface, likely, of what actually happened. There are many documents that still exist, and you can find them all online, but a lot of them were destroyed, very sadly, and that means that probably a lot of people will never see justice for the atrocities that were committed against them. Information of MK Ultra first made it to the public in 1975 thanks to what was called the Church Committee. It was a U.S. Senate committee headed by Frank Church. After he and several other whistleblowers came forth, an investigation commenced, and the unraveling of 20 years of disturbing experiments began. Hundreds of people suffered from the MK Ultra experiments, and many of them will never receive justice because of the destruction of the documentation and also because of the lack of accountability from the government of both the US and of Canada. Many people suffered deaths, illnesses, injuries, and a lot of people suffered psychological trauma, both the victims and their families. And it is very sad that the governments will not acknowledge these people and give them some sort of recognition and some sort of compensation for the atrocities that were committed on them. I'd say probably one of the only positive aspects to come out of MK Ultra were the advancement in ethics. Thankfully, after the whistleblowers brought the atrocities of MK Ultra to the attention of the public and the investigation started, a lot of people realized that there needed to be stricter rules when it came to ethics and morals in experimentation and in research. And that's it for today's case, guys. Thank you so much for spending your time here with me, and thank you so much for watching the video. It means a lot. If you wouldn't mind considering subscribing or liking this video so that my content can be pushed out into the algorithm, I would greatly appreciate it. And if you subscribe, then you'll catch my next video, which will be very interesting and exciting, just like this one. So thanks so much again, and have a good day and stay safe.